Welcome back. This is video number 2, part 2 of chapter 7, which deals with how we block entrance, or how the legal system can be used to block entrance in smaller geographic markets. Okay, this is the next video. That we did the introduction before, then this is small markets, and then of course the next video we'll do has to do with geopolitical boundaries. Okay, so getting started, what kind of local barriers are there? And in Shell, he points out that anything that needs to be built, moved, dug, or cut to make room for a new entrant is a possible target for some form of blocking strategy. This is in part because local governments have a lot of control over issuing permits for various kinds of construction projects. So this is common in the case of, like, for example, a Walmart. We mentioned this in the last chapter. We talked about Walmart a little bit, and coming into these markets, they need to build these ginormous stores, need a lot of space for this, and so the permitting process is where there can be a blocking strategy. Now, I was actually involved to a small degree in a blocking strategy here in Gig Harbor a number of years ago, and this is when Fred Meyer wanted to move across the highway and build 100,000 square foot giant super Fred Meyer. And this is just up the street from my house, and there was a lot of outcry over this. Now, I'm from Southern California, where traffic is a whole different level than it is here. So I always think it's kind of funny when people in Gig Harbor complain about the traffic, but there's some real concerns up at the corner of Point Fosdick and Olympic. Just literally, I could walk there from my house, and this new proposed Fred Meyer was going to be on the other side of the street. Now, what was interesting that I learned as I got involved in this a little bit, was that there was a city guideline where the maximum size building that could be built was 45,000 square feet. But the city has the power to give exemptions, and so they had given an exemption to Safeway to build a 60,000 square foot store. And so the argument that Fred Meyer used was, well, if you gave an exemption from 45 to 60, why wouldn't you give an exemption from 60 to 100? So effectively arguing that this square footage rule is meaningless, because if you give an exemption once, you can give it multiple times. Ultimately, that petition was turned down. Fred Meyer did move in there, but they built a much smaller store than they were originally planning. So the community was part of this, but of course, the owners of the Safeway development, and then there's another grocery store development across the street from Safeway. And that store is since closed, but there are 3 grocery stores, or at least 3 spaces for grocery stores, within just a very, very short walk of each other. And I'll show you a picture of a map from that. Here you can see the overview of this intersection. And right here is where the Safeway is, and across the street is where there used to be a what's it called? It's a Fred Meyer brand. The other brand, QFC. That's what it is. QFC. There used to be a QFC there, and then Fred Meyer moved from this space on this side of 16 across and built a new Fred Meyer here. So now we have Fred Meyer, we have Safeway, and then in this space, which is still empty, they're apparently going to get one of these high-end grocers type of places. But there's another one of those called it's just up the street, and blanking on its name. But anyway, there's another grocery store right here. So there's plenty of grocery stores on this corner, and there, as the locals will tell you, there's lots of traffic in the area. So in all 3 of these cases, this was an issue of building permits, getting necessary permits. The zoning, we'll talk about zoning here in a minute, about what that means. And then the regulations, and that was the example I gave you of the square footage limitation. That was a city regulation that had to be exempted. But those are how local incumbents can use each of these processes as a way of slowing down potential new development. Okay, so this leads us to our first, for this video, and I have new graphics for this, the first key legal concept. Okay, hopefully you like my new slide. Key legal concept is, what is zoning? What does that mean? Well, if you're not familiar with it, there's a reason why in your residential neighborhood there are no stores. And that's because it's zoned for residential construction only. That's why commercial construction is only allowed in certain areas. Going back to the overview map of the area near my house in Gig Harbor, you can see this is all residential area. This is where I live, this neighborhood here. And then next to my neighborhood is a commercial building. That's where my law office is. And then this is all commercial here. You can see the area of commercial, but then residential is behind it. So an area is zoned as either commercial or residential, and there's a bunch of different zoning levels and types and permitted uses. But basically, if you buy a piece of property in an area that's zoned residential, you can only build houses there unless you get the zoning changed. And the same is true if you buy a piece of commercial property. You can't build houses there unless you get the city to agree to change the zoning. And there's a whole process that's involved with zoning. The city can't just change it on no notice. There has to be due process. And hopefully remember this, we talked about due process before in this class, but there's two kinds of due process, both substantive and procedural due process. And the process of going through and getting a zoning change, the process of it, the notice, the hearing, the chance for appeal, all of those elements of a permit process, that's what we would call procedural due process. Now, substantive due process is where the actual question of whether the land use can be limited or not. Now, the other thing that's interesting about zoning is that, and I've studied a bunch of cases on this topic, and we don't have time to go into it, and I've written a few papers on this, but there is a Fifth Amendment protection against what's called a taking. So the government can take your property anytime it wants, assuming it follows due process procedures. But if it does so, it has to pay just compensation. And over the years, that provision of the Fifth Amendment has been interpreted to include some zoning requirements. So there have been cases where the city has changed the zoning, and as a result, the value of the property is very different. And in some cases, not always, but in some cases, the property owner can claim that that's a taking of all or part of the economic value of the property and sue the government or ask the government for compensation and sue them if they don't get it. Well, there's a lot of litigation on this area that I could do a whole class on, which I won't do, but just know that this is one of the things that the state or the city, states don't do zoning, it's done by cities and counties. That zoning, that's part of their power, and as long as they follow due process standards, they can change the zoning of a property, and that in and of itself can create a fight. And so I have an example of that for you. You see this logo on the slide here. This is a friend of mine, the Citizens to Protect the Cedar River. A friend of mine is part of this organization. He lives, it's up in near Bellevue somewhere, and they're planning to build an asphalt plant in his neighborhood. And so he and the neighbors are fighting this. Now, he's not trying to block it. He's not a competitive business, so it's not exactly the best example, but I thought of it because the strategy that they're using is very similar to one that would be used by an incumbent trying to block a new entrant. And that is arguing not necessarily that they don't want this asphalt plant in their backyard. They definitely don't want that. But they're arguing that it's unsafe for the Cedar River. So they're actually making a safety argument, a health and safety argument. And so my friend Scott, who is in this video here, that's the guy you see in this picture, he is part of the organization that's leading this charge. And when you watch the video, you'll notice that they don't say anything in there about we don't want this plant in our backyard. They talk almost exclusively about its effect on the nearby Cedar River. So here's the video.
Scott Giordano. I am co-chair of SaveTheCedarRiver.org, and we're here in an effort to try and stop a asphalt plant from being built about 150 feet from the Cedar River.
Hi, I'm Tamara Wydell, and today we're here protesting down at the proposed asphalt site for Lakeside Industries.
It doesn't have any business being here. It doesn't have any business being near the Cedar River. It's inevitable that you're going to get toxic waste dumped into the Cedar River. It's going to get dumped into our groundwater here, and so we're doing everything we can to stop it.
We've gone to the King County Council on a number of occasions and brought up the fact that this is not a good place for an asphalt plant. Reagan Dunn is the only one that has supported us and agrees that this is a really bad land use decision.
The county has spent $57 million over the last 20 years preserving areas along the Cedar River, and they're going to throw it all the way now by having an asphalt plant next to the Cedar River. It's shocking. It's going to be catastrophic. There's no way that you're not going to have toxic waste go into the Cedar River, and once it's in, you're not getting it out. And that impacts the salmon. And even King County acknowledged that when they did a moratorium about a year and a half ago on the building of this whole thing. They acknowledged it. We need the public support. That's the only way we're going to win here. The politicians will not help us. I've been shocked at how poorly the politicians have behaved. Most of the King County Council won't even talk to us. Reagan Dunn has done some for us, but not terribly much. And frankly, I'm disappointed by the politicians even more than I normally am. So really, we need folks to go to SaveTheCedarRiver.org and contribute, because the only way we're going to win this is in court, and the only way we're going to win this in court is with money.
Okay, so from that example, you can see how they are using the permitting process to try to block the construction of this plant. And again, they're neighbors that are trying to do that, but the same exact strategy could be used by a incumbent. And in fact, sometimes what the incumbents do is go and recruit the neighbors to fight this fight for them, because it sounds a lot more legitimate than if there was, let's say, a competing asphalt plant nearby that just didn't want a competitor. So sometimes you have to look carefully at these neighborhood groups that are rising up against some sort of permit or zoning or whatever it is, because sometimes they're backed by the incumbents who are using this as a rival blocking strategy. Okay, and we saw an example of a number of strategies that were used in the Forest City versus Taubman fight that was described in the book. I'm not going to revisit that whole story. You can read it in the book. But a couple points that come out of it that are important. First is that the more money that's at stake, the more complex these strategies become. That might seem obvious, but when there's millions or hundreds of millions or sometimes even billions of dollars at stake, the parties will spend massive amounts of money on these strategies to fight against each other. And when permits are required, these hearings can be turned into the battles that the parties can use. They can use it, and we saw this, and Taubman used this as sometimes just a way to slow things down, which gave them time to build their competing mall. But all of this, you have to watch out for antitrust, because if you go too far with it, if it's done purely for the basis on the basis of restricting competition, you can run into antitrust concerns. So this is why we see so many of these examples with the good story and the real story, because they have to worry about antitrust, about being perceived, either legally or just from public perception, as just trying to block competition, as opposed to having some other altruistic reason for blocking a new entrant. Okay, what questions do you have? Have you ever experienced anything like the Save the Cedar River, or anything where you've seen a blocking strategy that's been used? Tell us the story, or if you have any questions or any comments, post those in the forum. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.